The night of March 17, 1945, 23,000 feet above the Kobe Industrial District, Staff Sergeant Raymond Mueller pressed his face against the rubberized eyepiece of his blister gunner station aboard the B-29 City of Los Angeles. Through the plexiglass dome, the darkness was absolute. No moon. Cloud cover at 15,000 feet obscured even the faint glow of the burning city below. His breath fogged the sight glass despite the pressurized cabin's heating system. Then he saw it. A brief orange flicker at his 2 o'clock position, maybe 700 yards out. Not a searchlight. Not flak. The unmistakable muzzle flash of a 20mm cannon mounted on a Japanese night fighter. A Nakajima Ki 45 Nick. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Closing fast through the blackness, its pilot firing blind, hoping to walk his shots into the massive bomber's silhouette. Mueller's hands moved with practiced precision. He adjusted the reticle lamp on his reflector sight, dimming it to near invisibility so it wouldn't destroy his night vision. His fingers found the range wheel, expanding the circle of dots around the central aiming point. In the darkness, he couldn't see the enemy aircraft. He could only see where it was shooting from. What happened next violated every principle of optical gunnery that General Electric's engineers had designed into the most sophisticated fire control system ever mounted on a combat aircraft. Mueller aimed not at a target he could see, but at a point of light that represented death approaching at 300 miles per hour. He pressed the firing trigger. The twin 50-caliber machine guns in his upper rear turret roared to life, their muzzle flashes creating strobing snapshots of the night around him. The central fire control computer, located in its armored box below the deck plates, calculated corrections for ballistics, parallax, and lead based on inputs it was never designed to process. Mueller was feeding it data about a target, defined only by its weapon signature. For 3 seconds, he held the trigger down. 600 rounds per minute per gun, 1,200 rounds total, tracers lacing through the darkness every 5th round. Then, silence. The orange flicker disappeared. Mueller waited, counting heartbeats, scanning the darkness for confirmation. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Nothing. Either he'd missed completely, or the Nick had broken off its attack, or it was falling toward the Japanese islands below, its pilot dead at the controls, killed by bullets he never saw coming. Mueller never claimed the kill. Officially, it didn't happen. To admit that he'd scored a hit would have meant admitting that he'd fired at a target using a method that wasn't in any training manual, wasn't approved by any ordnance department, and relied on modifications to his aircraft's gunnery system that would have resulted in a court-martial if discovered. But in the pitch-black skies over Japan during the spring of 1945, B-29 gunners were discovering that survival demanded innovation. The magnificent fire control system that made the Superfortress such a lethal weapon in daylight became something else entirely at night. Something its designers never intended. Something that required mechanics, armorers, and gunners to push the boundaries of what was officially permitted, officially safe, and officially possible. This is the story of how American bomber crews adapted the most advanced gunnery system of World War II for a mission it was never designed to perform. It's the story of technical brilliance meeting battlefield necessity, of forbidden modifications that saved lives, and of the thin line between innovation and insubordination, when the only thing standing between a bomber crew and oblivion was their willingness to break the rules. The transformation began not in combat, but on the production lines where the B-29 Superfortress came into being. In the minds of engineers who were trying to solve a problem that had plagued bomber crews since the beginning of aerial warfare. How do you enable a gunner to hit a fighter aircraft moving at 400 miles per hour while he himself is flying at 250 miles per hour at 30,000 feet in temperatures 60 degrees below zero? The answer, developed by the General Electric Company between 1940 and 1943, was revolutionary. The Central Fire Control System, designated Model 2 CFR 55B1, represented the first practical application of analog computing to aircraft gunnery, 5 gunner stations distributed throughout the B-29 controlled 4 remote turrets, plus a manned tail position. Each station had its own dedicated computer housed in armored boxes below the deck plates. These weren't computers in the modern sense. They were electromechanical marvels of relays, servo motors, and synchro transmitters, weighing 50 pounds each, performing hundreds of calculations per second through purely mechanical means. The system worked through elegant simplicity. A gunner looked through his reflector sight at an approaching fighter. The sight displayed a reticle, a central dot surrounded by a circle of smaller dots. Before combat, the gunner set the expected wingspan of enemy fighters on a dial. A 0 measured 39 feet tip to tip. A nick spanned 49 feet. When an enemy appeared, the gunner placed the central dot on the target and adjusted a range wheel until the circle of dots exactly spanned the aircraft's wings. This simple action fed the computer continuous data about range and closing speed. Simultaneously, other inputs reached the computers. Airspeed from the pitot static system, altitude from barometric sensors, outside air temperature from thermocouples, the current heading from the compass, ammunition type from manually set switches that told the computer whether it was calculating trajectories for standard ball ammunition, armor-piercing incendiary, rounds, or tracer. The computer synthesized all this information and calculated 3 critical corrections. Ballistics correction compensated for bullet drop and wind deflection. A 50 caliber bullet fired from a bomber traveling at 250 miles per hour at 30,000 feet would arc 36 feet due to the aircraft's motion and drop 14 feet due to gravity at a range of 800 yards. Lead correction aimed the guns ahead of the target to account for its motion. A fighter closing at 400 miles per hour covered 117 yards per second. The guns might need to aim 200 yards ahead of where the gunner was looking. Parallax correction addressed the fact that the gunner's sight and the actual gun turrets were dozens of feet apart. The angle from the sight to the target differed from the angle from the guns to the target. The computer calculated this geometric relationship in real time. All of these corrections happened automatically, invisibly, faster than any human could compute them. The gunner simply kept his sight's central dot on the target and pressed the trigger. The central fire control system moved the turrets to the mathematically correct firing position. It worked brilliantly. In daylight, at high altitude, against targets the gunner could see clearly enough to track and range accurately. The system provided an effective engagement range of 900 yards, 50% farther than manually aimed guns, and more than twice the effective range of most Japanese fighters' weapons. From August 1944 through August 1945, B-29 seconds claimed 914 confirmed aerial victories against just 72 losses to enemy fighters in over 31,000 combat sorties. The central fire control system had proven itself in the crucible of daylight combat over the Japanese home islands. Then, in March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay changed everything. The daylight high-altitude bombing campaign wasn't working. B-29 seconds flying at 30,000 feet encountered jet stream winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, making accurate bombing impossible even with the Norden bombsight. Cloud cover obscured targets 70% of the time. Cumulative engine failures and battle damage were mounting. LeMay gambled on a radical new approach. Strip the bombers of most defensive armament to increase bomb load. Fly at night to avoid fighter interception. Attack from 5,000 to 8,000 feet below the jet stream, low enough for accurate visual or radar bombing of Japanese cities packed with wooden structures vulnerable to incendiary weapons. The first low-altitude night mission struck Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945. 334 B-29 seconds carried over 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs into the Japanese capital. The result exceeded every projection. Perhaps 100,000 Japanese civilians died. 16 square miles of the city burned to ashes. Only 14 B-29 seconds were lost, a casualty rate of 4% acceptable losses by the grim mathematics of strategic bombing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. LeMay's gamble had succeeded. The night incendiary campaign would continue, but the decision to fight at night created problems that no one had fully anticipated. The central fire control system, so devastating in daylight, became significantly less effective in darkness. The fundamental issue was target acquisition. A gunner couldn't range what he couldn't see. The reflector sights used a reticle lamp that projected the aiming dots onto the glass eyepiece. In daylight, this worked perfectly. The gunner could adjust the reticle brightness to match ambient light conditions, maintaining clear visibility of both the aiming marks and the target simultaneously. At night, the same system became a liability. If the reticle lamp was bright enough to see clearly, it destroyed the PORA, gunner's night vision, making it impossible to detect dark shapes against a darker sky. If dimmed enough to preserve night vision, the reticle became nearly invisible, robbing the gunner of precise aiming reference. The problem compounded with the plexiglass sighting domes. In daylight, these provided excellent visibility. At night, any internal light source instrument panels, status indicators, even the faint glow of the reticle lamp reflected off the curved plexiglass, creating ghostly images that obscured the gunner's view of the actual sky outside. Some B-29 variants received the APG-15B tail radar, which could detect aircraft approaching from behind and provide ranging data. But the blister and upper gunners, responsible for defending against beam and frontal attacks, had only their optical sights. If they couldn't see the enemy, the sophisticated computers were useless. Japanese night fighters exploited this vulnerability with increasing effectiveness during the spring of 1945. The Nakajima Ki 45 NIC, originally designed as a daylight heavy fighter, proved remarkably effective when adapted for nocturnal interception. Some were equipped with upward-firing 20mm cannon mounted in the fuselage, an arrangement the Germans called Schräge Musik, slanted music. The concept was devastatingly simple. The night fighter approached from below and behind, positioning itself in the B-29's blind spot where no turret could train. The pilot then fired upward into the bomber's belly, targeting the wing fuel tanks or bomb bay. The B-29's crew might never see their attacker until their aircraft was already burning. Other Japanese night fighters, including modified Zero fighters and the twin-engine Nakajima J1N1 Irving, lacked effective radar, but compensated with aggressive tactics. Their pilots would approach from any angle, firing long bursts from 400 to 500 yards, then breaking away before defensive gunners could respond. The American response began not in official channels, but on the flight lines of Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, where mechanics and armourers worked through tropical nights to prepare aircraft for the next mission. These men understood that the technology aboard the B-29 was sophisticated, but it wasn't sacred. It could be modified, it could be improved, and in some cases it had to be, regardless of what the technical orders said. The first adaptations involved the reticle illumination system. General Electric had designed the lamp with a rheostat that allowed continuous adjustment from bright to dim, but the lowest official setting was still too bright for effective night vision. Crew chiefs began installing additional resistance into the circuits, reducing the lamp's output below spec. This modification was technically forbidden. Altering the electrical system without engineering authorization violated multiple regulations, but it worked. Gunners could now dim their reticles to a faint amber glow, barely visible but sufficient for rough aiming reference while preserving their ability to detect dark shapes against the night sky. The second modification addressed internal light discipline. B-29 seconds in daylight configuration had numerous indicator lights, panel illumination, and status displays throughout the pressurized compartments. At night, this ambient light reflected off every surface, ruining night vision and creating reflections in the sighting domes. Mechanics began installing blackout covers, taping over unnecessary indicators, and rewiring cabin lighting onto separate switches that could be turned off during combat. Again, unauthorized. Again, necessary. The third adaptation was more controversial. It involved the ammunition itself. The standard loading for B-29 defensive guns was 4 ball rounds followed by 1 tracer, a ratio called 4-to-1. The tracers served multiple purposes. They allowed gunners to observe where their bullets were, going and walk the fire onto target. They provided visible confirmation that the guns were firing, and in formation flying, they helped coordinate defensive fire from multiple bombers onto the same attacking fighter. But at night, tracers became a double-edged weapon. Yes, they showed where the gunner was shooting, but they also advertised the bomber's exact position to every enemy pilot within miles. The bright streaks of burning phosphorus flowing from a B-29's turrets were visible from 5 miles away, creating arrows pointing directly to the source. More critically, firing tracers destroyed the gunner's night vision. The instant he pressed the trigger, the brilliant muzzle flash and tracer streams would overwhelm his dark-adapted eyes, leaving him effectively blind for precious seconds. Some armourers began loading different ratios. Instead of every 5th round being a tracer, they went to every 10th or every 20th. A few radical crews experimented with eliminating tracers entirely from the blister positions, reasoning that preserving night vision was more important than having visible feedback on shot placement. This modification was not just unauthorized, it was explicitly forbidden. The technical orders specified exact ammunition loading patterns. Deviating from them required approval from the Ordnance Office at wing level, which would never be granted for something as unproven as altered tracer ratios. Crews that made these changes kept them secret. They understood that if they were shot down and the aircraft recovered, or if an inspection revealed the modifications, they could face disciplinary action. But they also understood something more important. In the darkness over Japan, their lives depended not on following regulations, but on seeing the enemy before the enemy saw them. The real breakthrough came from the gunners themselves, men like Staff Sergeant Raymond Mueller, Technical Sergeant Frank Farrell, and dozens of others whose names never appeared in official after-action reports. They discovered something that General Electric's engineers had never considered. If you couldn't see the target, you could see where it was shooting from. Japanese fighters firing their weapons at night created unmistakable signatures. The muzzle flash from a 20mm cannon appeared as a bright orange-yellow flicker. The tracer rounds from 7.7mm machine guns drew red lines through the darkness. These flashes and tracers marked the enemy's position as clearly as a beacon. The technique that emerged was simple in concept, extraordinarily difficult in execution. When you saw muzzle flashes in the darkness, you aimed at them. You bracketed the flashes with your reticle, estimated range based on their brightness and frequency, and fired. The central fire control computer, receiving data it was never designed to process, still performed its calculations. It still compensated for ballistics, lead, and parallax based on the range estimate the gunner provided. But the gunner wasn't tracking a visible aircraft anymore. He was tracking a weapon signature, trying to extrapolate the position of a fighter from the location of its guns. This method violated fundamental principles of the fire control system. The computers required continuous tracking data to calculate lead properly. A gunner was supposed to follow the target smoothly, allowing the rate gyros in the computer to measure angular velocity and predict where the target would be when the bullets arrived. Aiming at muzzle flashes provided no such continuous data. The gunner saw a flash, aimed at it, and fired before the flash disappeared. The computer calculated lead based on whatever tracking motion the gunner had provided in the seconds before firing, which was often minimal or erratic, yet it worked. Not every time, perhaps not even most of the time, but often enough that word spread through the bomber groups on Tinian and Saipan. Enough that gunners began requesting specific modifications to their stations to support this unorthodox technique. The most significant modification involved the gun's convergence pattern. In the factory configuration, the twin 50 caliber guns in each turret were set to converge to have their fire paths cross at 400 yards. This was optimal for daylight engagements where gunners could accurately determine range and wanted maximum concentration of fire at typical engagement distances. But at night, when judging range by muzzle flash alone, 400 yards was often too close. Japanese fighters engaging B-29 seconds in darkness typically opened fire from 600 to 800 yards, staying outside what they believed was the effective range of the bombers' defensive guns. Armourers on forward bases began readjusting convergence patterns. They set the guns to cross at 700 yards, sometimes 800. This meant that at these extreme ranges, both guns would be putting bullets into roughly the same area of sky. The trade-off was reduced effectiveness at closer ranges. If a fighter closed to 300 yards, the twin gun streams would be passing on either side of the target rather than intersecting on it. But in practice, Japanese night fighters rarely closed that near. They would make one or two firing passes from long range, then break away before the B-29's gunners could respond effectively. Setting the convergence for extreme range gave gunners their best chance of hitting an enemy who was already at the edge of engagement distance. This modification was definitely not authorized. Armament crews were supposed to follow precise specifications for gun harmonization. Changing convergence patterns without orders from the Ordnance Office was a court-martial offense. The justification was that improperly converged guns might endanger other bombers in formation by spraying fire in unpredictable directions. But most night missions were flown, individually or in loose formations with aircraft separated by miles, not the tight defensive boxes used in daylight. The risk of hitting friendly aircraft was minimal. The armourers made the changes anyway, usually in coordination with specific gunners who requested them. They documented nothing. If questioned, they claimed the guns were set to standard specifications, and any variation was due to normal wear and alignment drift. The aircraft would be inspected after missions, and if anyone noticed the non-standard convergence, it would be quietly readjusted before the next inspection. The combination of modifications created an unofficial but effective system for night defense. Ultra-dim reticles that preserved night vision, reduced internal lighting that eliminated reflections in the sighting domes, altered tracer ratios that didn't blind the gunner when he fired, extended gun convergence that maximized hit probability at the ranges where muzzle flashes appeared. None of it was approved. All of it was necessary. And it began producing results. Frank Bud Farrell, a left blister gunner in the 19th Bomb Group flying from Guam, shot down at least 2 Japanese night fighters using this technique during missions in April and May 1945. His account, recorded decades later, provides one of the few detailed descriptions of the method in practice. "We were inbound to Osaka, flying at 7,500 feet, when I saw the flashes at 9 o'clock level," Farrell recalled. "Looked like a string of orange beads in the darkness, maybe 6 or 8 flashes in rapid succession. I knew it was a Nick or maybe an Irving, firing his 20mm at us from about 700 yards out. I dimmed my reticle all the way down, could barely see it, and swung my sight onto where those flashes had been. The fighter would be close to that position, probably slightly ahead of it because he was overtaking us. I set my range wheel for 700 yards, just a guess, based on how bright the flashes looked, and tracked that empty piece of sky for maybe 2 seconds. Then I saw another flash, shorter this time, like he was firing a burst correction. I put my center dot right on that flash and squeezed the trigger. I gave him a 3-second burst, probably 300 rounds between both guns in the upper rear turret. The tracers we were loading 1 in 20 by then, not the standard 1 in 5, arced out into the darkness. I couldn't tell if I was hitting anything. You never could at night, but the muzzle flashes from the Japs stopped. Either I scared him off, or I got him. I never claimed it because we weren't supposed to be shooting at targets we couldn't see properly. The whole technique was against regulations. But whatever happened, that fighter didn't attack us again that night, and we made it home. I'll tell you though, my hands were shaking for an hour after. Shooting at ghosts in the dark, hoping your bullets find something solid before their bullets find you. Farrell's experience was not unique. After-action reports from night missions during April and May 1945 contain numerous entries of possible fighter damaged or enemy broke-off attack attributed to defensive fire. Very few recorded confirmed kills because confirmation required visual observation of the aircraft going down, which was nearly impossible in darkness. But the accumulation of incidents suggested that B-29 gunners were more dangerous at night than Japanese pilots had anticipated. Technical Sergeant William Royster, an upper gunner in the 29th Bomb Group, provided another perspective in his post-war correspondence. People said the central fire control system was useless at night, that we were defenseless. That's garbage. The system worked if you knew how to use it for conditions the engineers never planned for. I knew the wingspan of every Japanese fighter, had them memorized. 0, 39 feet. Nick, 49 feet. Irving, 55 feet. When I saw muzzle flashes, I'd estimate the range 600 yards, 700, whatever, and set my range wheel to make the reticle circle match what that fighter's wingspan would look like at that distance. Was it accurate? Probably not as accurate as daylight shooting, but it was better than nothing, and it was definitely better than sitting there hoping they'd miss. The computer would calculate the ballistics and lead based on my inputs. If my range estimate was close and my tracking was smooth, the computer would put the bullets in the right place. We shot down fighters at night. I know we did. We just couldn't prove it, so we didn't claim them. Better to keep quiet and keep using techniques that worked than to report kills and have some colonel start asking questions about how we got them. The question that haunted these men was whether they were heroes or criminals. They had modified government property without authorization. They had deviated from established procedures during combat operations. They had concealed their actions from superior officers. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, these actions constituted multiple violations. Yet they had done so to increase their chances of survival and mission success. They had identified deficiencies in equipment and procedures, and when official channels failed to address those deficiencies quickly enough, they had taken matters into their own hands. The ethical ambiguity was compounded by the fact that their modifications worked. B-29 loss rates on night missions remained consistently lower than on daylight raids throughout the spring and summer of 1945. While this was primarily due to reduced Japanese fighter effectiveness at night and the lower altitudes keeping bombers below the worst of the flak, defensive gunnery still played a role. Japanese fighter pilots reported that B-29 seconds were more dangerous opponents than anticipated, even in darkness. Several accounts from Japanese airmen mention the unexpected accuracy of defensive fire during night intercepts and the reluctance of some pilots to close within what they considered safe firing range. The B-29's reputation as a flying fortress that could defend itself without escort began in daylight but was reinforced by night combat experiences. The official Air Force position, then and later, was carefully neutral. The central fire control system performed as designed under the conditions for which it was designed. Adaptations made by field personnel to address non-standard operating conditions were neither explicitly authorized nor explicitly forbidden, falling into a gray area of command discretion. Individual unit commanders had authority to approve minor modifications that didn't compromise aircraft safety or mission effectiveness. Whether the changes made by mechanics and armourers at forward bases fell within this authority was never definitively established because it was never officially investigated. The reason was pragmatic. By June 1945, the night incendiary campaign had effectively destroyed Japan's ability to wage industrial warfare. 58 cities had been burned. Japanese war production was in collapse. The strategic bombing mission was succeeding beyond every projection. No commander wanted to risk disrupting operations by launching investigations into technical violations that might result in courts-martial of experienced combat crew members who were winning the war. The policy became, don't ask, don't tell. If the modifications were working and not causing safety problems, they would be quietly tolerated. If anyone asked directly, the answer would be that all aircraft were maintained to technical order specifications and any variations were within acceptable tolerance limits. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to an abrupt conclusion. The B-29 groups in the Marianas prepared for demobilization. Aircraft began returning to the United States or being prepared for storage. The mechanics and armourers who had made unauthorized modifications now faced a different question. Should they return the aircraft to factory specifications before they were inspected for storage or scrapping? Most did. The ultra-dim reticle lamps were brought back to standard brightness. The blackout covers were removed. The ammunition loading patterns were returned to regulation 4:1 tracer ratios. The gun convergence patterns were reset to 400 yards. The physical evidence of the forbidden modifications disappeared. But the knowledge remained. The veterans who had fought at night over Japan carried with them an understanding that official procedures were guidelines, not commandments, that the gap between engineering specifications and battlefield necessity sometimes required bridging by the men doing the fighting. That innovation often came from below, from the maintainers and operators who understood their equipment's real-world limitations, and that sometimes the most important modifications were the ones never officially documented. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted and B-29 seconds returned to combat, many of the same veterans were back in uniform. The Superfortresses faced a new threat. MiG-15 jet fighters that could climb to bombing altitude in minutes and attack at speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. The Central Fire Control System, designed to engage piston-engine fighters traveling at 400 miles per hour, was marginally effective against jets. Once again, crews adapted. Some of the same techniques developed for night fighting over Japan proved useful against the high-speed, fleeting targets that MiGs represented. Ultra-brief firing windows required gunners to shoot at where the target was going to be, not where it was, relying on the computers to calculate lead for targets that appeared and disappeared in seconds. The ability to fire effectively with minimal visual reference, developed during night operations, translated to snap shooting at jets. But Korea also highlighted the obsolescence of the B-29 concept. Piston-engine bombers flying at 30,000 feet, no matter how sophisticated their defensive systems, could not survive against modern jet interceptors in daylight operations. After 1951, B-29 missions over North Korea were restricted primarily to night operations, where the techniques pioneered over Japan 5 years earlier remained relevant. The last B-29 combat mission was flown on July 27, 1953. The aircraft that had begun the war as the most advanced bomber in the world ended it as an obsolete platform kept in service primarily by institutional inertia and the lack of suitable replacements. Production had ended in 1946. Of the 3,970 Superfortresses built, most were already in storage or had been scrapped. The few hundred still flying would be retired within a decade. The Central Fire Control System, however, left a lasting legacy. The concept of remotely operated turrets, controlled by computing gun sights, influenced every heavy bomber designed afterward. The B-36 Peacemaker used an improved version with radar-aided tracking. The B-52 Stratofortress incorporated similar principles in its tail turret. Soviet bombers, reverse-engineered from the interned B-29 seconds they copied to create the Tupolev Tu-4, carried forward the same technological approach. Even as guided missiles replaced guns as the primary bomber defense, the underlying concept computers mediating between human gunners and remotely operated weapons systems remained foundational to military aircraft design. The innovation that mattered most, though, wasn't the technology itself. It was the adaptability of the men who used it. Raymond Mueller, Frank Farrell, William Royster, and hundreds of others whose names never appeared in histories proved that sophisticated systems are only as effective as the operators who understand their limitations and know when to improvise. The modifications they made were forbidden not because they were dangerous, but because they weren't tested, weren't documented, weren't controlled by the engineering bureaucracy that had created the original systems. The military, like any large organization, preferred predictability over innovation, standardization over adaptation. But wars aren't won by strictly following procedures. They're won by people who understand which rules matter and which rules can be bent when lives depend on it. The night skies over Japan in the spring of 1945 were a laboratory where official doctrine met battlefield reality. The Central Fire Control System that had been designed for daylight precision engagement became something else in darkness. A platform for improvisation, a foundation upon which gunners built their own methods, their own techniques, their own survival strategies. Did it make the difference between victory and defeat? Probably not. The strategic bombing campaign would have succeeded regardless of defensive gunnery effectiveness. Japan's industrial capacity was being destroyed, its cities burned, its supply lines severed. Individual B-29 seconds being shot down or surviving made little difference to the strategic outcome. But it made all the difference to the men in those aircraft. Every fighter driven off, every night mission completed, every crew that made it back to Tinian or Guam represented a victory at the human scale. The modifications that enabled those small victories were technically illegal, officially unauthorized, and absolutely necessary. The men who made them understood something that no regulation could capture. In combat, survival comes first, procedures second. When your equipment can't do what you need it to do, you modify the equipment. When your training doesn't cover the situation you're facing, you develop new techniques. When your orders don't account for battlefield realities, you adapt the orders. This wasn't insubordination. This was professionalism at its highest level. The ability to think critically, to identify problems, to implement solutions, to take responsibility for outcomes. The mechanics who rewired reticle lamps, the armorers who adjusted gun convergence, the gunners who developed new aiming techniques, were all acting to fulfill their primary mission, bringing their aircraft and crews home alive. That they did so by violating technical procedures was irrelevant compared to the outcome they achieved. The forbidden modifications of 1945 became the accepted practices of 1950. The experimental techniques tested over burning Japanese cities became training doctrine in updated manuals. The innovations that individual crews developed in secret were eventually recognized, validated, and incorporated into official procedures. But by then, it didn't matter. The B-29 era was ending. The men who had made it work were going home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.